It was a hideous and intimidating helm, forged of black demped steel in the shape of a twisted demon's head. Yet Ravage looked at it with fondness. It was her companion, her protector, the finest helm she had ever forged. The helm rested on a rock adjacent to her, watching with lidless eyes as Ravage knelt and splashed her face with water from the rocky stream. It was fresh with a sweet taste, and the harmonic gurgling of the water as it trickled along its path was tranquil and calming. Quartz crystals in the stream reflected the morning sun, giving the flowing stream an almost magical appearance, a glimmer of the beauty that was Sapphiron. Feeling refreshed, she climbed across the rocks surrounding the creek to resume her position. Crouched in hiding behind a large boulder beside the road, a dense growth of river weeds and thickets pushed their way up between the rocky stones, their tips flourishing with blossoming flowers of yellow and wild red. The peaceful morning had inspired her imagination, and as she daydreamed about the journeys to come, Ravage was roused from her thoughts by the familiar clinking melody of steel horseshoes on stone coming down the road. It was time. Ravage pulled back her long flowing midnight purple hair, donned her helm, then leant patiently against the boulder, her hand resting on the hilt of her long sword. Perched high upon the rocks above the road was Patsy, concealed from sight by a thick layer of overhanging branches from the forest's canopy. With this bird's-eye view, she was able to keep watch over the group of bandits as they slowly made their way across the glade, oblivious to the peril that lay in wait for them. As the bandits moved into the area where Ravage lay in ambush, Patsy notched an arrow in her bow and took aim at the lead rider, narrowing her eyes with dark thoughts of malevolence. The arrow struck the bandit with a heavy thud as the power of the ashen bow violently threw him from the saddle. Ravage emerged from her concealment and impaled the closest rider with her sword, mounted his horse and began to ruthlessly cut down his comrades. Her blade sliced through leather to sever limbs, found the vulnerable areas between plate armor to puncture the organs within, and destroyed necks to remove heads from their bodies. It was a scene of chaos and gore. All the while arrows whistled from above, stealing life from men who fell in despair. The bandits nursed sunken eyes and swollen cheeks, the aftermath of a night of hard liquor. They were slow to react to the ambush. The sudden attack, coupled with Ravage's demonic appearance and an unseen archer raining death upon them, filled the bandits with confusion, panic, and fear. They could not stand against Ravage's fury and skill. After a short skirmish, the battle was over. For 3 days, Ravage and Patsy had been stalking the bandits along the eastern roads after having heard how they brutally murdered a family in a cabin on the outskirts of Tandruit, a small and remote farming village in southern Engalia. Ravage had a penchant for vengeance. If these bandits thought they could murder an entire family without consequence, they were sorely mistaken. Injustice weighed heavily on her, especially at night. It had its way of preventing her from sleep. Ravage was always getting herself involved in other people's disputes, a trait her father claimed would get her killed one day, and in a brutal fashion. The pristine creek had been transformed into a horrific scene of blood and gore. Ravage removed her helm and surveyed the carnage. Patsy found her friend heavily splashed with blood, kneeling amongst the corpses, searching them for anything of value. It made her realize just how ruthless Ravage was. There was violence in the core of her being that made her almost as demonic as her helm. The murderous lust resided within Patsy also. Killing was easy, especially when it came to slaughtering men who were heartless and cruel. "Find anything good?" "Nah, nothing really. Just a few sovereigns. Their weapons were too notched and worn to bother taking to sell." Ravage rose and walked over to her friend. She detested the filth that had soiled her armor. It was going to need a meticulous cleaning. "I need a bath." "Strip off and wash in the stream then." Patsy grinned. The stream was barely a few inches deep. "No, I need a real bath," she said with a smile, half daydreaming. "With hot water." scented soaps and oils, in a nice, large tiled bath, with candles and rose petals. Well, it's going to be a long while before we're anywhere that civilized. Once we have our fortune, we're building the most epic bath in our fortress. Of course we are. A deafening roar erupted from within the forest, which shook the trees and sent a swarm of birds fleeing into the sky in terror. Patsy and Ravage froze, gripped with fearful anticipation. After a short moment of silence, another roar echoed from the trees, which began to moan and crack as if some great force was pushing its way through them. Ravage could see the branches bending and shaking. She looked at Patsy, and their eyes met, neither ready for the hellish monster that was about to descend upon them. From the tree line emerged a great beast, hideous to look upon, a shorku, an enigma of the world. Its body was reptilian, bulky, armored in heavy scales. Powerful insectoid legs supported the huge mass of its body, the vulnerable flesh of its arms protected under a barbed carapace. Rancid poison seeped from the pores on its mangled, dreadful face. The shorku howled in delight as it looked upon its prey, and the mass of corpses sprawled across the road. This was not the first time the pair had faced a shorku, but it was one of the largest they had come across. No two shorkus were ever alike, and when they bred, the offspring was a deformed beast spawned with foul mutations from each parent. The pair was ill-equipped to deal with a monster such as this. The wisest choice of action was to flee, and they did just that. Dashing across the rocks, they raced to their horses, which they had hidden away behind a wall of green undergrowth. The horses knew the shorku was close and were acting unsettled and tense. They were eager to leave the area, and held back no speed once mounted. Through the valley they raced, carrying their masters to safety. The shorku did not bother to chase them. It perched itself above the massive bandit corpses and began to feast upon the soft human flesh, blood spilling from its mouth with each bite. At noon, the girls stopped for a meal on a grassy knoll beside the road. It was the last of their food, but neither was concerned. Patsy was an excellent hunter. As long as she had her bow, they would never go hungry. The grass was luscious and thick. As Patsy sat enjoying an apple, she stared at Foxglove Mountain off in the distance. It was a wondrous place that she hoped to one day explore. "What are you daydreaming about over there?" Ravage smiled at her friend with fondness. Patsy looked adorable when she stared blankly in a haze, her mind off with the fairies. "Oh, I was just thinking about the mountain." "What about the mountain?" "Just that I'd like to explore it one day." Foxglove Mountain was alluring to her, its beauty, its mysteries. It was said to have deep, unexplored caves that led into the very heart of the mountain. Patsy wondered what ancient secrets lay within. Clouds amassed about the peak of the mountain. Ravage thought Foxglove beautiful, yet perilous. "I heard no one's ever returned from the mountain, that an ancient evil dwells there, and claims the souls of anyone who ventures within." "Well, it's not very different from the Broken Ravine now, is it?" The Broken Ravine was the destination the two warriors were traveling across the continent to reach. Its true name was the Ravine of Broken Memories. Yet people referred to it as the Broken Ravine, save in maps. It is the infamous ruins of a civilization that ended mysteriously eons ago. It is said that a vast wealth of gold and jewels lay hidden deep within the ruins, which is guarded by hideous monsters and the vengeful ghosts of the people who once dwelt there, who now harbor an eternal hatred of those who walk among the living. Countless adventurers and tomb raiders had ventured into the ruins to seek their fortune. So far, all have perished within the ruins. I guess that's true. Despite the ravine's infamous history, Ravage believed the wealth hidden within the ruins would be hers, and with it, she and Patsy could build their own stronghold and live as lords in a remote valley in the south. Ravage could build her forge and follow her dreams of becoming a mastersmith. a dream she strongly wished to make a reality. There were yet many leagues to travel before they reached the northern mountain ranges. The lands of the Angalian Empire stretched out before them. Western Angalia had a terrible, infamous history. A lot of horrible things had happened in that land, and evil has a tendency to linger. Heading further west would lead them into desolate and dangerous lands, forests littered with ruined castles and empty villages haunted by ghosts of the damned. For the next few days, Patsy kept a close eye on her compass. The road began to take them southwards. Then, much to her pleasure, she found that the road began to bend west, before turning north, until they were heading in a directly northern course. She still wasn't sure exactly where they were on the map, but was hoping they would soon emerge somewhere around Clasdale. As they continued, the forest surrounding them became increasingly denser. Ancient moss-covered trees bordered the road, their great branches reaching high and knitted together to form a thick canopy. Only sparse rays of sunlight could penetrate the ancient limbs, and broke through like blades of light piercing into the forest. They passed under a grand and elaborate archway, caked with the dirt of ages and covered in flowering vines. Ravage dismounted her horse for a closer inspection. Upon wiping some of the dirt away, she found the archway was in fact constructed of polished black marble and decorated with intricate carvings. I wonder what this is doing all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. I'd say it's the border of someone's land, said Patsy. Having stopped, she took the opportunity to have some water from her flask before tossing it across to Ravage. Given the state of the arch, Ravage surmised that this land had long been forsaken. Nobles didn't suffer their estates to fall into decline. A polished archway such as this would have cost a small fortune to construct. The family who owned the land must have been vastly wealthy. I wonder if anyone still lives here. She took a mouthful of water and threw the flask back to Patsy, who urged her horse onwards, eager to discover what lay ahead. After a short while, they could see the lonely structures of stone houses through the trees which slowly thinned out and opened into a large grassy estate. The houses were all destroyed ruins, with collapsed roofs, overgrown with vines and weeds, and surrounded by debris of broken stone and rotting wood. The ground was littered with piles of skeletal corpses. An army of soldiers still adorned in their rusting armor lay scattered around the estate, their bleached bones a terrible reminder of the weakness and mortality of man. Kneeling beside one of the corpses, Ravage ran her fingers across the rusting iron breastplate of his armor. The badly faded emblem of the Angalian Empire was barely visible upon it. I wonder what the hell happened in this place, she said, rising to her feet. There must be hundreds of Angalian soldiers here. It doesn't look like the aftermath of a battle either, said Patsy, surveying the scene. It looks like a slaughter. Could it have been a shore coup? It would have had to have been one hell of a colossal shore coup to kill this many soldiers and destroy all these houses. But I have this weird feeling that it wasn't a shore coup. I think these soldiers were sent here to fight something, and lost. If I knew where we were, then I might be able to understand all this a little better. Well, let's split up and see what we can find, suggested Ravage, who was eager to explore all the ruins. What about the Craven? Said Patsy. Ravage met her eyes, paused for a moment, and began muttering to herself. I forgot about them. Reaching into her pocket, she felt around, but didn't find what she was after. I'm all out of charms, too. I have one left. We should stick together, just in case any of those phantoms show up. This looks exactly like the kind of place they'd be. There was no argument there. They both knew this was precisely the type of place the Craven could be found lurking. Ravage hoped they'd find a cache of hidden treasure or stash of gold, but there was none. Filth, broken furniture, and cobwebs were all they found inside the ruined houses. They did happen across one strange thing. A grand old mansion stood on the very edge of the estate. Unlike the ruined stone houses, the mansion was completely intact. It was of tall and marvelous design. Built of stone and marble, it looked like the epitome of wealth and prestige. In front of the mansion was a large, resplendent pond, caked with stains and moss from countless years of neglect. In its center stood the figure of a proud warrior, halberd in hand, a symbol of the strength and valor of men from ages past. Ducks were frolicking and enjoying the cool water of the pond. Patsy notched an arrow in her bow and took aim. The arrow brought down a plump duck. Panicked, the others took to the air in flight. "Dinner? Dinner," nodded Patsy, who had acquired quite the taste for roasted duck, especially if it came with pineapple and a good beer. The pair were perplexed by the oddity that was the mansion, so out of place in this simple village of plain stone houses, and why had it not suffered the same ruinous fate as the other structures? "Do you think someone still lives in it?" asked Patsy as her eyes swept over all the windows, expecting to see a face peering out at her. "I doubt it, unless a bunch of vagrants that have decided to squat within it. But even then, I don't think so. It's a little weird. A little too weird." Ravage peered over her shoulder to check on the horses. They were both moseying around, chewing on the thick grass at their leisure, without a care in the world. "Let's do it," said Ravage, unsheathing her blade, caution taking hold. She knew anything could be waiting inside, and she wasn't going to be caught off guard. As Patsy ascended the stairs, there was pep in her step. She was gripped with a calm sense of excitement. Wealthy nobles had a reputation for being quite eccentric. Her curiosity was piqued as to what unusual oddities could be found within the mansion. An elegant D, outlined in silver, was fancily carved in the oak door. The door gave no resistance when Ravage twisted the knob and pushed it inwards. It swung open effortlessly, and without sound. The mansion had a musty smell. A thick layer of dust covered everything within. Beautiful rugs lined the floors while paintings and tapestries hung proudly from the walls. The corners of the rooms decorated with tasteful statues and vases. It reeked of style and wealth. They were met by more of the same prestige and luxury as they continued through the mansion, room after room of excessive lavishness. Ravage sheathed her blade. There was nothing threatening or ominous within these walls. In the cellar, they found a glorious bathhouse fashioned from polished marble. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors lined the walls. There were beautifully crafted sinks with taps forged in silver. Elaborate and provocative statues stood gracefully next to grand marble pillars. Ravage was overjoyed when she discovered that the taps still had running water, and in a servant's room in the back was a large copper boiler to heat the bath water. The girls' smiles and laughs didn't die down for a long time as they planned out who was going to cook the duck while the other prepared the bath. Dinner was nothing short of a feast, minus, of course, a few culinary luxuries such as hot bread and butter. Patsy had found some fruits and herbs in the gardens around the mansion. Their spirits were high as they dined on silver plates and drank from crystal glasses, both feeling spoiled by the extravagance of it all. They ate heartily and shared laughs as they reminisced stories from their past of both battles and adventures. Ending the night soaking in a hot bath was like a dream to Ravage. She lay in the water, her skin absorbing the warmth and scented oils. It was nothing short of heavenly. Patsy lathered her skin with a blue soap, leant back against the side of the bath, and stared across at her friend with a smile. "This place is amazing," she said, closing her eyes and tilting her head back. "We should live here. It's too far away from everything." Ravage smiled when she noticed that Patsy had bubbles stuck to her nose ring. "Who cares?" said Patsy, and at that moment she didn't. She never wanted to leave the mansion. She had surrendered herself to its magnificence. The whole reason for us going to the Broken Ravine was to get enough gold to build our own stronghold. But here we have an abandoned mansion all set and ready for us to move in. That was true. The mansion had everything they wanted, except for her forge, though she could probably forage and melt down enough silver from within the mansion to be able to pay a craftsman to construct one. "All right," agreed Ravage, leaning forward. "Let's do it." Let's live here." Slowly, Patsy waved her arms back and forth in the water, the broken surface lifting the fragrance of the scented oils. Her body felt totally relaxed. Living in a mansion, they had really struck gold this time. They chose a simple guest room on the second floor to sleep in. It was quite plainly decorated, with soft furnishings and 2 large beds. The windows had a wide view of the back of the estate, which they opened to allow the cool night's breeze to flow inside. The 3 moons were high, and an ambient light flooded the room. Patsy was exhausted, and the soft feather pillows quickly stole her off to sleep. Ravage felt relaxed, yet restless, and sat on the edge of her bed in a singlet, running a stone along the edge of her sword for a long time, lost in thought. There was a long road ahead of her, so many difficult tasks to accomplish to get the estate back in order. There was also a small army of corpses to bury. With a sigh, she sheathed her blade, leant it against the oaken table beside her bed, and laid down, the soft blankets giving her a surprising amount of comfort. In the dark hours of the night, a strange scraping noise roused Patsy from her sleep. Sitting up in bed, she glanced across at Ravage, who was sound asleep, the room still aglow with soft moonlight. The scraping noise hadn't ceased. There was a loud thud out in the hallway, followed by what sounded like footsteps. And then all was quiet. Patsy thought of waking Ravage, but decided against it. There was no point disturbing her sleep for nightly noises that were probably nothing. Patsy sat upright for a while, listening for any more noises. There were none, so she laid back down. No sooner had her head hit the pillow than there came another loud thud. Curiosity claimed her, and she rose out of bed. Picking up her short sword, she crept over to the doorway and cautiously peered out into the hallway. Only moonlight and shadows greeted her. Just as she considered returning to bed, there was a scraping noise. It seemed to be coming from the room next to theirs. Patsy looked over her shoulder at Ravage and wondered if she should wake her, but once again decided against it. She could handle this by herself, whatever it was. The night air was cool and sent a shiver up her naked legs. The marble tiles cold against the soles of her feet. Dressed in only underpants and a loose-fitting shirt, she began to really feel the coldness of the night. She hadn't noticed the temperature drop under the thick, warm blankets on her bed. Darkness greeted her as she silently stepped into the vacant room. The shutters were drawn, so no moonlight could enter. There were ominous silhouettes amongst the darkness. As she crept further into the room, the strange scraping noises stopped. Then abruptly footsteps echoed behind her in the hall. Fear took her. Patsy turned suddenly, grasping tightly to the hilt of the sword, yet she saw nothing behind her. A shiver ran up her spine, when another loud thud came from deeper within the mansion. Mustering her courage, she left the room and proceeded down the hall towards the source of the noise. At the end of the hall was a large winding staircase. A wooden gargoyle sat perched at the head of the railing, and in the darkness, its face looked twisted and possessed. Its hideous gaze made her skin crawl. The loud thudding echoed up out of the darkness. Taking hold of the railing, she stared down into the chilling darkness below. Patsy's imagination began to run wild with horrible possibilities of what lurked in wait for her down in the shadows. Slowly, she backed away from the stairs. Whatever was making the noise, she didn't care. Her nerves had taken enough. She decided to go back and wake up Ravage. Patsy could no longer stand this feeling of fear and loneliness. As she turned to walk away, she felt something clutch onto her shoulder. Gasping in terror, she spun quickly and lashed out with the sword. There was nothing there. This was too much for her. She knew something had grabbed her. It felt too real, too solid to have been her imagination. Hurriedly, she rushed back to the room. "There's something here," she whispered to Ravage as she softly shook her awake. "There's what?" said Ravage, rubbing her eyes, waking from a dream in which she was deep in the ocean, surrounded by an eternal void of water, watching a colossal Hershey shark swim below her. "There's strange noises coming from downstairs, and something touched me out in the hall." "Something touched you?" Alarmed, Ravage sat up. "What was it?" "I don't know," answered Patsy. "When I turned around, nothing was there." "Craven?" "I don't know." "Do you have that charm?" Patsy fumbled through her bag in the darkness until she found the charm and returned to Ravage's bed. "Here," she said, handing it to her. Ravage unsheathed her blade and began to walk out of the room until Patsy grabbed onto her arm. "Don't," she said, shaking her head. Ravage could see the fear in her friend's face, glanced over at the door, then turned back to meet Patsy's eyes. "All right," she said with a slow nod. Even though the charm could destroy a Craven, it was best not to be overly confident possessing one. The Craven were horrible creatures and perilously dangerous. Ravage reached out and closed the door, clicking in the lock on the back of the knob. "We'll stay in here," she whispered, "and don't go wandering off alone again." "I won't," said Patsy, and crept back to bed. Ravage leant the sword back against the table and sat the charm beside it. If anything were to happen, it would be close by. For a long time she laid awake, staring at the ceiling. Patsy worried her sometimes. She was too curious and headstrong and liked doing things alone. Ravage always felt a degree of fear when Patsy was out alone. She much preferred to be by her side, to protect her in case anything ever did happen. But then Ravage was always going off doing things alone as well. She wondered if Patsy worried about her as much. As these thoughts ran through her mind, finally sleep came. Again she found herself in the depths of the ocean. A mighty crash awoke them as the door to the room was violently thrown open. An invisible force pulled Patsy from her bed and dragged her screaming from the room. Absolute terror gripped Ravage. For a moment, she was frozen. Patsy's screams of horror brought her back to reality, and she raced from the room after her friend. As Ravage raced for the door, she was suddenly struck by a mighty force and thrown across the room, crashing painfully against the wall and fell awkwardly atop a wooden table. The impact broke several of her ribs and sent a wave of agony through her chest. Moonlight ceased to pierce the windows, and the room was utterly dark. Every shadow appeared menacing and looked like the silhouette of a twisted demon closing in upon her. Breathing came painfully. Before she had a chance to rise to her feet, something grabbed her by the hair and pulled her violently off the ground. The invisible force pushed her against the wall, smashing her face brutally against the hard wood, and then tossed her across the room as if she were weightless. Blood ran down her face from a cut above her eyebrow. Ignoring the throbbing pain, she pulled herself to her feet. Eyes struggled to see in the darkness. Even though nothing moved, and the room was eerily still, she knew they were here. The Craven had come for her. Anger stirred within her. Ravage refused to be tormented and killed by those who were cowards in life only to be given strength in death. She abhorred the Craven, treacherous, deviant phantoms that fed on the weak and helpless, coming upon them unawares and with false guises. Ravage was not at the bottom of the food chain. Bottom feeders and scavengers should know to flee before those who possess souls burning fiercely with true strength and fortitude. Moving fast, she took hold of the hilt of her sword and pierced the blade with the divine charm. A flash of light erupted from the sword as it became infused with a burning blue aura. Suddenly, the Craven were visible to her. Dozens of the grotesque phantoms surrounded her. They were hideous to look upon, both men and women in haggard clothing, with rotting flesh and wounds that oozed with foul blood. There was one Craven that stood out above all others. Her eyes were black as onyx, and her hair danced in a wind that did not exist. Fury was in her scream as she sprang at Ravage, her twisted, cruel arms reaching out with gnarled fingers. The enchanted blade tore apart her ethereal body. It was the first time since death that the Craven had known pain. As its spirit essence was destroyed and faded into the void of nothingness, it let out a terrible howl, high-pitched, full of agony and despair. Ravage did not pause for even a moment. Turning her attention to the nearest Craven, she tore its body asunder before swinging the blade in a wide arc to send two more of the hideous phantoms into the void. The other craven fled before the divine light of the enchanted sword, vanishing into the shadows. Their cowardly escape fueled Ravage's rage, and she cursed at them. Patsy's screams of fear and pain echoed from the hallway. A surge of adrenaline raced through Ravage's blood, and she flew from the room. Invisible hands held Patsy in the air, choking her violently, while others tore apart her shirt and dug into her flesh, viciously ripping apart the skin and sending streams of blood flowing down her chest and legs. Patsy lashed out at her attackers with what little strength she had in a futile attempt to save her life. Without an enchanted weapon, she was helpless and could do nothing against the craven's pitiless and sadistic onslaught. Never had Ravage been consumed with as much wrath as when she saw Patsy suspended in the air, a pool of blood below her, surrounded by craven mercilessly tearing at her flesh. Her scream of rage shook the hall, escaped the windows, and startled the nocturnal animals foraging in the undergrowth, so their gaze turned suddenly to the mansion. The craven set upon her. She wielded the enchanted blade with great fury and hatred, tearing apart the ghostly essence of any craven that came within the sword's reach. Patsy's body was dropped to the ground as the others fled before Ravage's wrath. There was no time to check Patsy's wounds. Ravage wasn't sure how much longer the enchantment would last. The only thing on her mind was to escape the mansion before they were rendered defenseless. Blood spilled from Patsy's wounds as Ravage lifted her off the ground and draped her over her shoulder. She could feel the blood dripping on her and running as small streams across her skin as she carried Patsy through the mansion, the sword's light illuminating the dark halls. At the bottom of the staircase, it assailed her, stepping from the shadows unseen. A strong black hand seized Ravage by the throat. A strange sensation coursed through Ravage's system like poison, and her body went limp. Patsy and the sword both fell to the ground as Ravage no longer had control of her limbs. Patsy had lost so much blood that she was barely conscious. Everything to her now was like a waking nightmare. Ravage could feel a powerful aura consuming her, altering her will to its own desires and owning her completely. A horrible feeling of helplessness filled her mind, such vulnerability. It was sheer terror. Her life was now in the hands of a creature that had seized her from the darkness. The creature loomed over Ravage, penetrating her with its sharp yellow eyes. Its stature was so much greater than hers, its black body heavily muscled. It was unclothed, its long dark hair curling around the tips of its feminine breasts. Shock and confusion took Ravage as she realized this monster was female. There was a presence inside her, invading not only her thoughts but her soul also, probing her, reading and judging the strength of her mortality and convictions. Never before had she felt so naked and exposed. The creature held her in its gaze and tightened its grip around her throat. Ravage was unable to draw breath and felt that death was upon her. Those hellish yellow eyes, the last thing she would see as her life fades away. Slowly, the creature released its grip on her neck, gently left her standing and backed away. It turned its back on Ravage, and with a soft, guttural growl, stalked off into the mansion, its long tail swinging in its walking stride. The creature from the darkness had shaken Ravage to the very core. She stood in bewilderment, staring into the shadows, hands trembling with fear. She couldn't believe she was still alive, and her thoughts immediately turned to Patsy. Blood was seeping terribly from her wounds. Instantly, Ravage crouched over her friend. Patsy's body felt cold and moist. She was going into shock from the blood loss. Ravage scooped her up and draped her over her shoulder once more and carried her out of the mansion, the enchanted blade left lying where it had fallen. The sensation of the cool night air on Ravage's skin made her feel as though she was in another world, a peaceful one, and quiet. She glanced over her shoulder at the mansion, its dark windows staring coldly back at her. It had totally defeated her, stolen from her, and left her bloody and limping under the weight of her battered friend. She turned away from it, never to look back. When Ravage carried Patsy into the yard where she had left the horses for the night and found that they were gone, Her first instinct was to panic, for she dearly loved Musk, and had not the heart to endure her loss. Her anxiety was short-lived, for she knew Musk and Jaden were very intelligent, and both had a keen sense for detecting evil. Their corpses were not in the yard, nor was there any sign of commotion or bloodshed. For that, Ravage was thankful. It was most likely that the pair had sensed danger and fled, a wise choice, as horses would do well to avoid the undead. From their saddles perched on the wooden fence, Ravage took a small purse. It was something she never travelled without. It contained herbal salves, rare ingredients, and bandages, everything one needs to clean wounds and keep them free of infection. Over the years, she had known many strong warriors who had lost their lives, done in by a small wound that had festered and become rotten. She had no illusions about her body, and knew that her flesh was weak. Wounds needed to be cleaned. No human was invincible, no matter how strong or skilled in battle. There was no food in either saddle. There was a glass bottle of water, though. Ravage tucked it into the purse. The only other thing Ravage took from the saddlebag was a small demped knife. Removing it from its sheath, she inspected the dull grey blade. It didn't look like much, but it was both sharper and stronger than steel. She wasn't going to be battling any shorkus with it, but it made a perfect stealth weapon. Used as a shiv, one stab in the neck was more than enough to kill a man. Into the forest, Ravage carried Patsy. Her legs ached under the strain, yet she pressed on until she felt as though they were far enough away from the mansion to be safe and to finally rest. She dragged Patsy's body into the center of a thick hedge of bushes. If she was going to rest properly and actually sleep, then she needed to feel safe. The hedging of scrub she had chosen kept them concealed from most eyes. Doubtless a keen nose would pick up their scent, but that was not something she could control. Many deadly creatures stalked the forests in the wilderness. She just had to hope to remain undetected. Using the knife, Ravage cut away Patsy's torn clothing. Her wounds were horrible. Though most of them had stopped bleeding, a slow trickle of blood ran between her breasts. Ravage tenderly caressed her friend's cheek. There was still color in Patsy's face. Her breathing was soft, yet stable. Ravage had seen men being butchered, women burned alive at the stake. But seeing Patsy wounded was the most horrific to her. Nothing else came close. She reached into the purse and began mixing ingredients in a small ceramic bowl. There was rose-seed moss to help the skin mend, kujen petals to fight off infection in a bed of mud to thicken the mixture and help it adhere to the body. Gently, Ravage wiped up the dried blood and applied the salve to the open wounds, before carefully bandaging it up. She was happy with her work. Hopefully the wound should mend without issue. Ravage was exhausted now, and lay down next to her friend. She held Patsy's hand as she closed her eyes to sleep. Within an instant, she was back there, in the depths, the sharks swimming below her. As Ravage's eyes opened from sleep, she took a deep breath and yawned. The morning air was damp, the cold feeling of dew on her cheek. It was barely light. Her body felt so immensely tired. She felt as though she could do with a few more hours' rest. A lingering pain emanated from her chest. It will be a while before her ribs fully heal. Patsy was sleeping peacefully. Ravage leant across and brushed a few stray hairs from her friend's face. Patsy's eyelids were fluttering. A dream. Ravage hoped it was a nice one, and not a nightmare from her encounter with the Craven. She clenched her fist, remembering the blood gushing from Patsy's wounds as the phantoms held her aloft. With a sigh, she released her anger. They had survived. Conjuring images in her mind like that would only bring her anguish, so she quelled them. Dry leaves crumbled as a dark silhouette began circling the bushes in which they were hiding. Ravage held her breath as the creature pressed itself against the soft branches and dug at the ground with its heavy feet. Instinctively, she reached for her sword, before realizing that it was no longer in her possession. With only the demped knife to fight, Ravage did not like her chances if she were to battle against the denizens of the forest. The beast cast an intimidating shadow as it stalked their position. It knew they were in there. The creature snorted, flaring its nostrils. Ravage shook her head with a smile. She knew that noise. Slowly she rose and pushed her way through the damp branches until she found Musk's face poking in at her, nuzzling her as soon as she appeared. Jaden was there also, standing a few feet away, looking on curiously. It was a surprise Ravage had not expected, and it was most welcome. "Thanks for scaring the shit out of me," she said as she rubbed the mare's soft cheek. Leaving the concealment of the bushes, the damp grass felt icy against the soles of her feet, numbing them while the chill air bit at her naked legs. Ravage ignored the discomfort as she began to explore the area. Patsy had lost a lot of blood and was going to need to eat. A few suspiciously colored mushrooms grew at the trunk of a tree close by. Not trusting their appearance, she chose not to pick them. She continued to search amongst the ferns and undergrowth until the morning sky turned bright and blue, yet she found nothing edible. With a heavy heart, she returned to find Patsy sitting on the grass soaking up the morning sun. Jaden had laid himself down beside her, and she was thoughtfully twisting the long hairs of his mane between her fingers. "You're awake," smiled Ravage as she approached. Patsy slowly ran her hand across her bandages. "You patched me up." Her eyes were kindly and thoughtful. "What happened? How did we escape?" Ravage sat down and gave her an account of the night's events. Patsy couldn't remember much after the attack in the hallway, and was overwhelmed that Ravage had carried her all the way through the forest to safety. Truly, she was a great friend. There were no words to express the love and bond of friendship Patsy held in her heart for Ravage. "Staying in the mansion was a really bad idea. I should have realized something was wrong with that place," said Ravage. "Don't worry about it." Patsy met her friend's eyes. She knew Ravage felt guilty for the injury she had suffered. It seemed safe enough, and it was so beautiful inside. We just let our guards down. There's no way we could have known the place was haunted. That's true. The memories of relaxing in the bath came flooding back, feasting and laughing with crystal glasses and silverware. It had been nice inside the mansion. Those yellow eyes, they came to her like a punch in the face, abrupt and shocking. A chill ran through her as she remembered the overbearing presence of the mysterious beast. "I thought there was—" Patsy lost her words when she noticed a small boy standing behind a tree staring at them. He stepped out onto the grass. His face was soft and innocent, with large, soulful eyes and a button nose. His chest was bare, and from the waist down he was covered in a living moss, with clover and small white flowers running down his legs. There was a peaceful aura emanating from him. Ravage bade the boy good morning as he approached them. He replied with a kindly smile and crouched down in front of Patsy. He reached out curiously and put his hand on her chest. As she looked into his eyes, they changed color, from blue to green to gold. His lips curled into a warm smile. As he moved his hands across her bandages, a hot, tingling sensation began to fill Patsy's chest. The damaged flesh started knitting itself back together seamlessly, with no sign of trauma or scarring. Patsy began to feel wholly strong again. The blight of the Craven's darkness abated from her mind, for the Craven can leave an evil taint upon the living that slowly corrupts their morality, poisoning their thoughts and steering them down a path of wicked deceitfulness. Slowly, his hands moved down her chest, to her stomach, where his smile turned into a frown. From the ground he picked up a broken twig. As he held it in his hand, it began to sprout with life, growing in length and girth as buds and leaves began appearing. Quickly it became a branch laden with many fruits and berries, with a sweet aroma that tantalized the senses. Gently he laid it at her feet. "Thank you," said Patsy, overwhelmed by the gift. With a warm and courteous smile, he arose, turned, and began walking into the forest. Patsy called after him, but the boy didn't respond, quickly disappearing amongst the undergrowth. "A forest spirit," said Ravage. staring into the trees where the boy had disappeared. Amazing. Did you see how his eyes changed color? Patsy ran her hand across her chest. Her skin felt warm. Must have something to do with his healing abilities. Ravage was still trying to comprehend what just happened. Seeing a forest spirit, let alone interacting with one, was so extremely rare. Patsy arose and stood beside Ravage. There are many ancient creatures and spirits that inhabit Sephiron, too few of them benevolent. Sephiron never ceases to amaze me, said Patsy. Let's eat some of this fruit. It looks so good. The sweetness of the fruit mixed with the tantalizing aromas that were unleashed with each bite filled not only their stomachs, but their hearts with joy also. Truly, this was a divine gift. They saved a few pieces to eat later, readied the horses, then set out into the forest, their spirits soaring. The forest was dense with ancient willows. The gentle movement of their great limbs in the breeze sounded as a soft melody. The girls, sitting atop their horses, gave themselves willingly to the tranquility of their surroundings. Under the shadows of the canopy they rode, through fern-laden glades and across clear rocky streams, until the sun moved across the sky, and the coolness of the evening began to bite their naked skin. By a small campfire they sat together, cooking a plump whisker eel Patsy had caught in one of the small streams. They ate under the light of the stars and talked for many hours as best friends do, until finally they curled up together amongst the roots of a great tree and slept. Their sleep went undisturbed. They awoke feeling refreshed and strong. Ravage did not agree with the brisk morning air and yearned to feel the warmth and comfort of clothes again. Her singlet didn't cut it as a lone garment. Patsy's only covering were the bandages still wrapped around her chest. She thought to remove them since the forest spirit had healed her wounds, yet they provided a degree of warmth and modesty, so she left them on. They had covered quite a good distance through the forest the previous day, and Ravage's hopes were high that they would soon return to something that resembled civilization. After a frugal breakfast, they continued their journey through the forest. The beauty of the land amazed Patsy. For a short while, they shared the company of a small flock of black-crested redfinches. Their chirps and melodic songs made the girls feel relaxed. The sun was so warm and the forest so beautiful that they rode along in ignorant bliss, until a deep-throated roar echoed from nearby. The pair kicked their horses into a gallop, racing from the area at high speed. In their unarmed state, it was best to steer clear of any and all forest predators, especially Shorku. Shortly after midday, they happened across an old road of compacted gravel, wide enough that two carriages could easily pass each other. They could see the road stretching across grassy hills for miles in either direction, yet it was void of travelers. Not a single soul or carriage was heading in either direction. There were many rocky outcrops on the road, as well as the encompassing forest, making Ravage wary of bandit ambushes. She and Patsy kept close to the tree line and stayed doubly vigilant. Northwards they rode, slowly, into the waning sun. Their journey was faring well until Musk began sniffing the air curiously before stopping abruptly. Her behavior became extremely anxious. Without prompting, the mare left the grass and ventured into the borders of the forest. Ravage lightly pulled on the reins and tried to coerce Musk to stop, but the mare would have none of it and continued, unyielding to her master's commands. With her keen eyes, Ravage surveyed the forest, continuously peering back over her shoulder. Something had frightened Musk terribly. Ravage could neither see nor hear anything that would cause such a strong reaction from the mare. Once concealed under the thick canopy and dense foliage, Musk stopped and began to calm. Ravage dismounted. She whispered kind words and patted Musk gently to soothe her rattled nerves. "I wonder what spooked her so badly," said Patsy. Musk's behavior had unnerved her. The mare had obviously sensed something dangerous close by, and there were many creatures to fear in this part of the world. "I'm not sure," said Ravage, glancing back towards the road. Curiosity had its claws in her, I'm going to go to the road and have a look around." "Then I'm coming with you," said Patsy as she climbed from her saddle. The pair stealthily crept to the edge of the forest. They concealed themselves amongst the thick green leaves of a tall fern, 4 eyes searching for the source of Musk's unease. The breeze bent the long grass this way and that, while slow-moving clouds drifted across the horizon. There was nothing unwonted about the afternoon, the cause of Musk's strange behavior a mystery. Satisfied that all was well, Ravage began to rise when Patsy grabbed her arm. "Look there," she whispered. Over the hill rolled a carter, his wagon pulled by 2 tall black geldings. Below his curved hat was a pair of rosy cheeks and a well-trimmed beard. He was alone on his cart except for the gourd of ale on the bench beside him. "He looks like a merchant," said Patsy. "Don't tell me your horse is scared of this old man. Don't be an idiot. There has to be something else around." There had to be. Musk wouldn't act weird for no reason. "We should go talk to him. Even if he's not a merchant, he might be able to tell us where we are." Ravage hoped that he was indeed a merchant. There were quite a few barrels and wooden crates in the back of his cart, so it was quite likely that he was. She dearly wanted some clothes. It would be very fortuitous if he happened to be carrying some meat, and maybe some weaponry too. Just as Ravage began to emerge from behind the fern, a hideously awful cry bellowed from the sky above. Patsy quickly reached out and grabbed Ravage, pulling her back behind the sheltered camouflage of the thick leaves. The carter's eyes widened with terror as a great shape descended upon him. The creature's wingspan was immense and shrouded the cart in shadow. It landed fiercely and with its giant scaled legs crushed the wagon as if it were made of straw. The beast flapped its feathered wings in triumph as it mounted its prey. 6 monstrous eyes stared down the carter. The hideous beast screeched loudly, sending the horses into a frenzied panic. Trapped in the wagon's harness, they could not escape. Its black beak opened, revealing a disgusting tongue dripping with saliva. Gums lined with deadly long teeth, rotten and putrid. Its long neck stretched forward as it consumed half the carter's body in one bite. With its second, the man was gone, never to be seen again by human eyes. With powerful talons, the beast seized both horses and tore them away from the bonds that held them to the wagon. Taking flight, it carried the screaming geldings into the air, whisking the hapless steeds off to its eyrie to devour them at its leisure. Patsy's body was trembling with fear and excitement, her skin covered in goosebumps. It had been several years since her last encounter with a towhern, in which she witnessed a pair of the hideous beasts decimating a herd of wild horses. Towherns covet horseflesh above all other meat. They are such powerful creatures that not even a brigade of knights could protect their steeds, should a towhern decide to attack. "Well, that answers that question," said Ravage. "But I'll be damned if I know how Musk was able to detect that one of those monsters was close by." "We're really lucky that wasn't us," nodded Patsy. Towherns were such insane creatures. They both amazed and terrified her to no end. "Come on, let's go check out the wagon." Ravage pushed her way through the fern. She gave the sky a good looking over before proceeding to the cart, making sure there were no more towherns lurking above. In the center of the road lay the cart, broken and ruined, its wooden wheels crushed to kindling. Mangled boards jutted out in every direction, splinters of wood piercing outwards like sharpened spears. The carter's blood was sprayed across the ruins, a macabre scene of death and destruction. The barrels and crates from the cart were empty, save one which was packed full of deer pelts, beautiful and soft. Ravage bundled them up, and that night by the fire she stitched them into makeshift clothes. It took great effort without proper tools, and the end result wasn't much to look at. But they were better than nothing. She adored the feeling of the soft fur against her skin after having spent so many days practically naked. It was divine bliss. They slept like lambs that night as they huddled together, cozy and warm. When the sun arose, Ravage didn't feel the morning's bitter chill and was ever so grateful. The pair continued to follow the road, confident that soon they would be out of the wilderness.